Thank you very much. Great energy in the room. Very pleased and happy to hear that. Sounds like you guys are doing a good job of loving each other already. We're going to do some questions here. I have some questions that people have sent in previously that I'd like to ask my friends to discuss. Also, questions are coming in via Twitter, so continue to send those in. We'll get as many of those in as possible. The first question, and you guys can do rock, paper, scissors and decide who's going to answer this one first. It's something of a strange thing to host an event on race and those who are marginal in the city as diverse as New York, where the two main people doing the talking are white men, but they're nice white men. I just want to say that for the record. What limitations do you feel most acutely as a white male? So what limitations as a white male do you feel when talking about race? And secondly, what unique perspective do you feel you can bring to the conversation on race? So what limitations do you feel, sort of internally, but also anything unique that you feel you can bring?
Well, I'll start with the last part. You can maybe explain why we're here. It's easy for me to talk about my limitations. So, the first third of my book talks about my history of being embedded in white Southern racist culture. So I bring that to bear everywhere I go. Knowing I came out of that and knowing what it was, what it did to people, what it did to me. And I hope what it bears witness to, that I'm beginning to see some things. And so I feel like I bring witness to the power of the gospel to liberate a racist white kid from Greenville, South Carolina. I bring the weakness of an urban pastor who doesn't have an ideal church, and thus I witness to the incredible difficulty of lining up more than one speaker out of 20. Incredible difficulty, whether it's in your church looking for elders, whether it's in the city looking for friends, whether it's in a conference. In other words, I'm 32, I'm just about finished. So it isn't going to get any better at my church under me. It's over. There's the testimony. And it's imperfect. So I witnessed to that limitation. And the reason I wrote the book is I knew I would be criticized for writing the book as a jerk, as a failure. I mean, it's just, what are you writing a book on race for? You can't even do it. And the answer is, well, so what? I mean, no, I mean, you don't write it because you're a failure? Well, why would that stop you from writing it? I love the gospel. I mean, if I didn't have the gospel, I wouldn't be able to make it through the day. So that book is designed to recruit us and you. Just get on the train and just do the best you can. If you're bent toward individualism, be the best Christian individualist you can. If you're bent towards whatever, then do the best you can. And I think, so one more limitation. I bring a wintry, easily depressed, moody, somewhat self-pitying, often emotionally stuck personality to everything.
Why did you move to Minneapolis?
Very simple. You go where the jobs are. So when I bring that to every situation, I am prone to quit quick. I mean, it's clear that Anthony has some critiques, right, of the book and of the conferences and of the things we've read and whatnot. So there was a day, I think, when I'd be sitting here and say, I think I'm going to go home. I don't think I want to talk to this guy. He didn't find the book. Well, I've been there so often, absolutely so often, that I just decided about 16 years ago, I'm going to get on this train. And if I don't do any good, I just think it's the one going in the right direction. The train meaning efforts at racial diversity, efforts at racial harmony. And so I guess the lesson out of this little gut spilling is that don't take your ball and go home. When you make a little effort, you write a little paper, you give a little devotion, you make a little effort in the structural area or the covenantal area or the individual area, you make a little effort and somebody pushes back a little bit on you, you didn't get it right, you don't get it, you blah, blah. Don't quit. Don't quit. Just come back, keep talking. So that's a little bit of what I bring. Now, why are we here? Why were these two white guys sitting here in New York where they ought to be?
There are two parts of the question I was thinking. The first is, you don't forget every event has a history. So if you had a bunch of, just Redeemer all by itself sit there and said, let's have a discussion about race in New York City, you probably have 5 or 6 different people representing different racial groups in the city. But the way this began was that John wrote a book I think is a very important book for us to read. We began talking about him coming and talking about the book, and so, in other words, the event grew out of that, and that's the history. So it started with a white guy, and I'm the pastor, and I'm a white guy, so that, so it's white.
And I'm
heavy.
not.
That's right. It's white heavy. So the point is, it just grew that way. So, but I think the question of the other part of the question was limitations as a white man. Is when I tried to counsel people who are having problems with their children before I had children, when I tried to talk to people who, who were married before I was married, and if I try to talk to people who are struggling with systemic racism when I'm a white person, and therefore I'm generally part of the systems that inflict it, I've had lots of limitations over the years. I think most Catholic priests, for example, who have never been married and don't have any children, still can probably spend a fair amount of time listening to people well enough to help folks. And I do think it's my job as a white person to try to listen, just like Anthony already said. But by the way, the reason why I'm here is over the years I've had plenty of non-white Christian friends say, if non-white people are always talking to white people about their racism, that's not good enough. You've got to have some white pastors talking to white people about racism. So I'm just doing what I was asked by non-white people.
There's another question here as it relates to power. Talk a little bit about power as it pertains to race in society, and also how about the church. To set this up, sometimes these discussions about race, we conflate and confuse race and power, or even race and we confuse race and class. And so what you have sometimes is you have a group of middle-class whites with a lot of social capital and power, engaging in discussions on race with African Americans who have very little social capital and power. And oftentimes what that means is that the discussions of race often end up on white terms, where blacks are asked to move toward whites in ways that challenge them, but whites are often freed up to be challenged and really stretched to move toward blacks in some profound ways. So there's a power dynamic that actually sometimes makes this discussion even more difficult. So the both of you, although we're all sitting here together, you all represent a different level of power than I do. You could tweet my books out of existence. I tweet, if I make a negative comment about your book, I get attacked. So there's a power differential that often happens in these conversations. So how do we talk about power, cultural power, and how that connects to the gospel in society and in the church?
Well, I mean, that's a very hard question. In fact, I think I know an example would be, well, I'm going back to what Maya was trying to say about systems. An example, this isn't quite the same. You were starting to move in the direction of discussions. But, for example, the evangelical world is based on raising your own support. It's just the missions program, it's all based on the idea you go out and you raise support amongst your friends. This, of course, is a systemic, it excludes and marginalizes people who aren't white. Because what happens is even people who aren't, white people who don't think of themselves as very well off can do it. They can raise their support. And not just black, but Hispanic, Asian people, and most people think of Asians as very prosperous. Asian people have trouble raising support for various cultural reasons. That whole model privileges white people. It doesn't privilege cultures in which that kind of volunteerism works. It certainly doesn't privilege black and Hispanic people who don't have lots of well-off friends. And yet there's the system assumes that everybody who goes out there would have equal social power, and they don't. Now, I would call that a systemic problem, a big systemic problem that basically keeps, very often these organizations, huge parachurch organizations, that you have to raise your support, and you come up in the power structure, having raised your support, and then you kind of go on staff and you move on your way up. Now, I know, by the way, InterVarsity, and I know plenty of places understand this, and they're trying to do everything they can to recognize the fact that people don't start with the same amount of social power. Right. And therefore, we say it's a level playing field, we're meritocratic, we're individualistic. That is to say, everybody has an equal chance. We're not giving anybody an extra leg up in any way, and of course what that immediately does is destroy the people who already don't have a leg up, even though it... So, I just think white people have got to be looking... Maybe somebody's offended by what I just said. The system, it doesn't mean, for example, that everybody in a ministry in which everybody has to raise their support is deliberately, intentionally trying to marginalize people. But nevertheless, the system is worse than the individuals in the system. And just by being part of it, you're just participating in this. White people have to learn how to have those kinds of spectacles, is what I was trying to say. They have to be thinking about that. Same thing happens inside churches. Very often what it means to say we want to have a multiracial church is we want everybody to become white. Right. Culturally white, act white, think white, make decisions like white people. And without knowing, we're saying, why are you always protesting? Why are you always, having a problem? We're open to everybody. So I think that's the sort of thing you're talking about. And it does help. One of the reasons I'm glad to be a white person in an urban setting is even though white people are not the majority, I mean, they're still the dominant minority, have vast amounts of social power. And yet here over the years, 23 years here, I've just been forced to see over and over and over again, I'm being insensitive, I'm being blind, I'm being, as time goes on, the only reason I know anything about my car, I only know things about my car that have gone wrong over the years. So after being 61 years old, I understand cars pretty well, because practically everything in any car I've ever owned is broken down at some point. Same thing with race. It's only by offending people, having arguments, realizing I've blown it, that over the years I start to, and a couple people have said, all I want from you as a white man is not to be anything else. I just want you to be surprising me. In other words, I want you to, as a Christian white leader, I just want you to surprise me. You know a little bit more about what it's like not to be white than most white, because most white people have no idea. And so actually that's a little bit like what John was trying to say. All I'm struggling for is just to surprise non-white people a little bit, that I would even notice that kind of thing. That's how bad it is.
Let me take the question about power just as an occasion to express the difficulty of just talking biblically in view of those kinds of social realities. So I think a bold, black, white, Asian, Hispanic pastor, when he wants to talk about power, should begin with the Bible and probably go to Luke 22 and talk about the disciples' desire for power and desire to be at the right hand, the left hand, and say, I don't want you to be like that. I want you to be humble. I want you to be broken and meek. And the Son of Man came not to be served. Now, as soon as if a white guy especially starts preaching like this will be perceived, very likely, by some as the manipulation of Scripture to keep minorities in their place. So the Bible, what are you getting so uppity about power for, when in fact the Bible calls all of us not to care about power? So stop caring about power. Now, what I'm saying is that ought to be preached. That ought to be preached. And then there ought to be this perceptive turn and awareness to say, whether you want it or not, if you're a majority culture person, you carry it. Mm-hmm. You carry it, and you don't know that you carry it, and to be aware that you carry it might give you opportunities to do what Jesus said that would in fact lift others up. So it is a very complex thing to take biblical truths that summon servanthood and not caring about power grabbing and not turn that immediately into a defense of the status quo, where everybody's lined up in their classes, everybody's lined up in their races, and therefore you've blinded yourself and others to the fact that love, back to your call to love has other things it does besides not take power. It might, for somebody else, take some power for them, use some power for them. So just an occasion of the complexity of trying to say what the Bible says fearlessly, knowing you're going to be criticized, and then try to come at the complexities from the side.
Right, that's fantastic. What you've both actually been talking about is white privilege. For those who wonder what the definition of white privilege is, we've got a question here from Twitter directly related to that. That's what they've both been talking about, this idea that the whites have the privilege of actually being free from the burdens of being a racial minority. That is, whites have the freedom, the privilege of not actually thinking about the types of things that I have to think about every day when I go to work. For example, there were a series of studies that came out in several education journals over the last few years that described that my teaching evaluations, I wish I had known this when I started my vocation, I would have done something else, when a black male professor stands in front of a room of predominantly white students, this has been scientifically studied for over a decade, I have a 5 to 10 minute window on the first day of class to dispel the notions of what my students assume black men are like. I have 5 to 10 minutes. If I fail in the 5 to 10 minute window, my evaluations will be lower. So I had to spend a lot of money to re-wardrobe myself and wear bow ties, although I do like bow ties, to wear bow ties, to stand in front of my students, and basically act like Mr. Rogers on the first day of class, because that affects the way in which they see me. Now, my white colleagues are free.
Right.
They don't even have to worry about those things.
As a pastor, if I'm a white pastor, and you come in, you might look around and, well, in other words, if somebody walks into a church and sees a black pastor, an Asian pastor, a Hispanic man up front, they assume that this is either a black or white or Hispanic. It's a Hispanic church or an Asian church. So I don't have to work that hard to get diverse people in my congregation. They're used to white people being in charge. Okay, so in other words, people of ethnic minorities are kind of used to white people being in charge. They're fine. White people are not used to non-white people being in charge. So they walk in, and if they see a non-white person up front, it's going to be hard for the non-white pastor to keep them there. And what I think Anthony's trying to say is there's a million examples of it. I still think, the reason I mentioned the raising your own support, it shocked me, it took me a long time to see, that even not very well-off white people have way more social power. Way more. If they can raise their support, and black people can, Hispanic people can, very often, as you know, non-white people who've gone to Ivy League schools and supposedly have all these credentials and all that, they go out and try to raise their support, they can't do it. That immediately tells me, oh, it takes generations In other words, the white privilege that comes to me has accrued over generations, and it won't go away very fast. That's what there's a million examples of it. We could keep going, but we probably shouldn't. So.
Right. One more question here from Twitter. Both of you pastor churches where there's a number of interracial marriages. And there's some Christians who still wrestle with God's creational design for particular races. Now, this isn't just a white problem, right? It's not just whites who think this, right? I've had several family members warn me, okay? Whatever you do, okay, I had a cousin tell me this, right? Hope she's not watching, okay? Right?
Too late,
right?
man, too late.
Okay, sit me down. Sit. Whatever you do, you should have seen her face. Don't ever marry a white girl. Ever. Okay. So this is not just whites objecting. There are blacks that object and multiple races. So how do we think biblically? How do we think about the gospel? How do we think about the kingdom and all that God has in creation as it relates to those who object to interracial marriage as something unnatural that God did not design?
Well, my guess is that most of those cultural objections are not based on that depth perception, but rather it's just, I would just, in the black situation, I just read the book, Is Marriage Just for White People? Have you seen? Yes. It's really amazing. So I was nodding my head up and down, yeah, look, this is not just a white issue here. Written by a black Stanford professor. The issues there are not biblical, they're not theological, they're loyalty. And she's saying to you that, what about us? What about us? What about the family? What about, does it matter? I'm reading into her. But anyway, if you want me to answer that deeper question, my answer is creation, number one, in God's image is 10 million times more important than color, skin differences. Number two, there are instances of interracial marriage in the Bible. Moses, I think the story of Moses marrying a Cushite is not only there, but is there intentionally, and I think that probably Miriam's hand, when she gets on his case, turns white as snow. Is God saying, you want white for this man? I'll give you white. And then in Jesus, there's neither Jew nor Greek. And then fourthly, the meaning of marriage as a husband loving a wife as Christ loves the church gives an occasion in an interracial marriage for something beautiful, for God to triumph over that as well, the male-female divide, the personality divide, the culture divide, and now a racial divide, all of that overcome by the kind of covenant-keeping love that marriage is. So I find it very difficult to find warrant in the Scripture for a principled opposition to interracial marriage.
Yeah, I'd add one thing, Anthony. I think it's idolatry to insist you should only marry within your race. Now, I'm talking to Christians now for a minute. But and I used to say this, Kathy encouraged me to do it. We used to tweak our older white people in the South in the 70s and 80s. I said, I would look at them, I said, be honest, you would rather have your child marry a non-Christian white person than a Christian black person. And they get very quiet. And I said, in other words, race is more important than grace. Race is more important than God. Your identity is not in the gospel. It is in your race, and you have a huge problem. And some of people out here know I don't like to confront, but I just think the text insists that that's the case.
You don't like to confront? You do that every Sunday.
Oh, but I don't like it.
Got to be the unhappiest man on the planet, right?
Why did I become a preacher?
Here are a couple of questions about your churches. I'll ask them both, and then you can answer accordingly. The first for you, John, as a white man leading a more diverse church, What have you discovered is the most important thing for you as a majority culture leader when thinking, leading, and talking in a multi-racial and multi-ethnic context? So what's the most important thing for you as a majority culture leader when thinking and leading a multiracial, multi-ethnic context? And then for you, Tim, as a white man leading a largely biracial white and Asian church, what have you discovered is the most important thing for you as a majority culture leader when thinking, leading, and talking in a multiracial, multi-ethnic context?
Most important is a very difficult question. I think most important is my own personal brokenness before God and the gospel, and a sense of desperate neediness for grace, so that I don't, as much as God enables me, don't operate out of a position of self-righteousness. That would start there. Second thing I would say is the testimony that has come to me over the years is that you care and that you try means a lot. That's what they said. Just generally, that you care, that you try. And then I can remember back in the days when we just were so bad at trying to do ethnic music. We tried to do diversity, and I sat there thinking, this is bad. And friends, ethnic friends would come up and say, thanks for trying. And they meant it. They really did. They meant it.
Right.
Because they knew
that's so special. Bless your heart, y'all try.
Now that would not sound encouraging. There's a way to say it and a way to say it. And the third thing is I just give yourself to people that you know that are different from you, and give yourself to the Word. Grow in relationships and grow in what the Bible has to say.
Yeah, I'm glad you went first, because I think I just have to echo that. The thing I'll especially echo is, if you are a pastor now and you say, we really want to stretch to be as diverse a church as we possibly can, to show Ephesians 2 is true, the gospel brings down barriers, you'll always be having problems. You'll always be falling short. You'll always be getting some criticism. There'll always be conflicts. And it's typical for white people. Anthony was I was really glad he mentioned that. I should have mentioned it myself. Is that white people can turn the race subject on and off anytime we want. In other words, if you're white, you came here because now you're subjecting yourself to the subject for a while. Then you can go back and essentially escape it as long as you want. And non-white people, every single day they look in the mirror and they're having a race seminar. Okay, so what that means then is, as a white person, we white leaders can get we want to say, I don't need this. I just want to preach the word. I don't want to have to do this. If trying to become diverse means I'm starting all these arguments and people saying you don't understand, I just had it, and you just can never do that. That's the price you pay to try to, as much as possible, get your church as far into Ephesians 2, even if it just gets the nose in the tent. Get your church as far into Ephesians 2 as you can, and that is a price you pay, and you're willing to do it. You're just willing. This is fine. To some degree, as a white person, I'm a big part of the problem, and therefore it's the least I can do. So that idea of trying and always falling short, and always feeling like you're falling short, and always being told you're falling short, is just something that you just say, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself, because that is a very white thing to do.
I see one more thing.
Yeah, sure.
If you're a leader of any kind in a majority culture situation, you shouldn't be intimidated that you can't go as far as Tim or I or Anthony said you should go. So I'm sitting here listening to Anthony say, okay, we've done this, now we need to go deeper. Now you might be sitting there saying, I didn't even get to here, or I didn't get to here, or I might be saying that. And I just want to make sure we all know that the average person in our church isn't at first base on this. Anything you say that pushes towards diversity, anything you say that pushes towards racial harmony, anything that raises the issue, at least I'm talking about church now, that raises the issue, you've made a little progress. So when you're operating at a scholarly level and should be at a scholarly level, and you can say, go further. But don't fret that any effort you make in waving Ephesians 2 or Revelation 5:9 or Genesis 1:27 or the gospel for the sake of loving across lines, that's helpful.
Fantastic. One more question, and we're almost out of time, so we'll have to give a quick answer to this. We recognize now that the heartbeat of Christianity in the world is not Europe. It is not the United States. It's in the East, it's in Africa, it's in the global South. So how does the reality of the fact that the center of Christianity has nothing to do with North America and Europe, how does that affect the way in which we begin to think about race here in our context as well, especially as immigrants from all over the world are coming to this country and even to our churches? I mean, how do we think about that, and the fact that we are in fact more globally aware because of all sorts of media opportunities as well?
Well, we certainly should expose the idolatry that fears that fears the browning of America, that fears the fact that white will be a minority by 1242 or so. That if whites start to get, what will happen to my America? See, what this world, where is your treasure? Who are you? Are you a Christian or are you? So exposing that fear, then I think humbling ourselves and pointing to the magnificent things God is doing, Africa, South America, Asia, and celebrate that and continually hold up the final picture of the new heavens and the new earth with all of its racial diversity, and celebrate that so that people don't feel threatened by diversity. So saying that it's coming here increasingly because of who's coming and who's here, and the fact that the power shifts and the intensity and effective, fruitful mission shifts have gone from London to Colorado Springs to Buenos Aires is a glorious thing of what God is doing. But now here's the last thing I want to say is I also don't buy the fact that our day is over, missiologically or influence-wise in the world. I want to say to the young people in my church, if you hear that all the power is shifting and all the dynamic is shifting and all the energy is shifting and all the growth is shifting to the global South, what are you going to do with that? Well, I guess I'll just become a businessman and not care since we can't have an influence. I say, no, that's not what you're going to do at all. You're going to dream of new partnerships and new ways and maybe a revival so that we can join the South Koreans in their missionary influence, the Argentinians in their missionary influence. That's the way I want to think. I really have a sense that all the global South talk in the last couple of decades has kind of produced in some a kind of defeatist, the Spirit has passed us by, the day is over in America, so you might as well just, get a good job and go to the suburbs after all. And I just want to work against that with all of my might.
That's
25 seconds.
Yeah.
Sorry, I took your time.
Well, no, it's such a big subject. It's a huge subject. It's very good for the West because what's happening, of course, is Western cities right now in Europe and to some degree in America are being evangelized by people from the Eastern and Southern Hemisphere. It's actually happened in New York. In other words, starting in the 70s, the number of churches planted by people from Asia, Latin America, and Africa and the Caribbean in Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens is astounding, by the way. It's really changed. I don't think anybody's quite come to grips with it. It used to be, essentially, it was Eastern and Southern Europe, which means it was all Jewish and Catholic. And now it's because it's people with people from Eastern and Southern Hemisphere, it's just changed the face of New York City. and it's happening elsewhere. So even from that point of view, God's providentially using the Eastern Southern Hemisphere to re-evangelize the West, and that's wonderful. Then everything he said, I agree with. And then lastly, we still have enormous resources. It's going to be a long time. We have such resources. We've got to put ourselves into a servant mode. That's it. We have to recognize that we're the tail. We're not the dog anymore. But we have huge amounts of resources, and we also have all the theological educational institutions. And generally it means that we have to go into a servant mode and a listening mode and use our resources, not think we have, all the power is gone. Well, the demographic power is gone, but the social and economic power we still have a lot of, and we have to get into a servant mode. That's it.
Thank you very much, John Piper, Tim Keller. Thank you.